I don't know if everybody can see me, but I'm the old guy with the white hair here. And Bob Davidson, I'm class of 67, and I'm coordinator of the Dartmouth Bridges to Impact program. I'm a former president of the Dartmouth Club of DC, and I'm a retired federal executive, mostly at the U.S. Department of Education, and I consider myself a proud member of the deep state. This is the first of our virtual-only seminars of the Bridges program, and very likely our remaining monthly seminars will also be virtual only. Tonight's seminar is also the first of what we hope will be a strong schedule of Dartmouth Club of DC virtual only events. I'm glad Yasuda Shaw is here, so you might chime in a second, Yasuda. So I was just going to say that our hopes are to provide book talks, seminars with Dartmouth professors, cooking lessons, and for sure a series of coronavirus, I hate this word because it sounds like you're mixing a beer and a virus, coronavirus updates led by distinguished Dartmouth alum healthcare leaders. Okay, a quick note for those who don't know about the Dartmouth Bridges to Impact program. We provide career mentoring and monthly developmental and educational seminars for first-year out Dartmouth graduates who are entering public service and other social impact careers. And the program is supported by Dartmouth Center for Social Impact, formerly part of the Tucker Foundation. If anyone's interested in learning more about the program and possibly serving as a mentor or seminar leader, please let me know. I had been thinking about including a topic like this in our schedule of seminars over the year when George raised his hand and had this with this topic. And so not only does George have strong background and real enthusiasm for the subject, he also has the technical skills to moderate a Zoom meeting, which is exactly what we need at this time in history. Unfortunately, one of our folks who was going to be on the program, Matthew Mosk, 93, a senior ABC News producer, an investigative reporter, and a mentor in this year's Bridges program, is not able to be with us tonight due to urgent work demands. He hopes to help lead another media-focused seminar in the future, but we are fortunate to have with us, I hope you're there, Matt Brown, 19, one of our current Bridgers, who is the mentee of Matthew Mosk, who's working as a fact-checking reporter at USA Today. So if everybody think about questions on fact-checking when Matt gets the podium later on. Okay, so without further ado, I'll turn over the podium to our seminar leader and Zoom moderator, George Linzer. And I wanted just to say, we know I'm sure he'll talk a bit about his new publishing operation, The American Leader, which is appropriately one of the notable efforts now underway to help address the problem of misinformation and disinformation in the media. Take it away, George.
All righty. Thanks, Bob. And thank you to everybody who made the call tonight. Just very glad that everyone in your circles are healthy enough so that you can be here. A few pointers for some of the new Zoomers. Okay, so again, thank you very much for joining us tonight. The timing of this is interesting because we're at a time now with coronavirus where the need to get information, reliable, expert vetted information out to the public is critical. And sadly, we've seen one of the great faults in our media system over the last month, as the media is obligated to cover the President of the United States, who somehow fails to convey accurate information about the situation on a daily basis. This presentation isn't going to provide any solutions to that problem, but it will highlight that among other other elements of the situation in our media sphere today, and offer some of the solutions that we're working toward. I think Matthew Mosk, who Bob had mentioned, would be in a better position to address how broadcast media can mitigate the spread of that disinformation from the people they're intending to cover. So I'd like to just start, and let's hope that this video is going to play. I just want to start with this video that came out a couple of years ago. So just bear with me. And
hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 yeah, I think they got that right. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. Not sure, well, I am sure which is worse. You know, the message that these individual anchors were disseminating, that the sharing of biased and false news is rampant in the media, and that there's one-sided reporting. Sure, but is that worse than the Sinclair Broadcasting Network participating in a clear messaging campaign that is verbatim putting out the same language? That is indeed dangerous to our democracy.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica.
So tonight I'm just going to peel back some of the layers of mistrust and try to get at some of the root issues involved. And then we'll look at some of the efforts that are being made to restore trust in media. This is not going to be a comprehensive or fully in-depth presentation. I think Bob mentioned, you know, we hope to have other seminars on this topic, and it would take a lot of them really to scope out all the tentacles involved in this issue. But we're going to start tonight with the business model that it's a pretty much 100-year-old business model, and try and identify the flaw that's baked into the system, this information ecosystem that we've got. Then we'll take a look at some of the technologies that have evolved and magnified that flaw. And finally, we're going to look at the politics involved, because quite frankly, if it wasn't for the politics of the day, I don't think we'd be talking about mistrust in media and disinformation. I don't think we'd be having this seminar tonight. So this, I got into this a long time ago, when I was kind of a bit of a smart ass in junior high. And I decided to do a comparison of the free press in the US and the state-controlled press in the USSR. Yeah, I'm dating myself a little bit. And, you know, the free press and the independent news is a pillar of our democracy, whereas state-controlled news is a pillar of authoritarianism. Here we value many voices. There, they wanted one voice, the voice of the state. The kicker, though, is that the news we consume is influenced by the clients of a multi-billion-dollar PR industry. In the USSR, their news was influenced only by state objectives. So in some ways, you could say consuming news was a little easier in the USSR. At least they knew where their news was coming from. So this whole ecosystem evolved in the 1920s when Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays established their respective professions. Over the decades, these two professions, journalism and public relations, grew up kind of like conjoined twins. I like to say they were joined at the writing hand, and I'm afraid that a lot of the time it seemed the PR industry was the top hand. I'm going to read this first paragraph from Bernays' book, 1928 book, Propaganda. This laid out the art of public relations. And he starts the book with this paragraph. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. That's a pretty scary statement to be made and to be forgotten, quite frankly, over the years. I think the implication is that beneath the headlines that we see in our newspapers, that we hear on the radio, that we see on the internet, beneath the headlines of the media stream, there are some very powerful currents that are shaping our futures. And we rarely glimpse those currents because really, I think the headlines are pretty effective at distracting, distorting, and obfuscating what we see through our window, through our window on the world, which is the media that we consume. This was true during the golden age of mass media in the 50s and 60s. And I think it's even more true today. So after cable evolved in the 80s and the internet came along in the 90s, news went to a 24/7 model. No longer did we just get a morning paper and see the network news at 7 o'clock. Now we've got a 24/7 stream of headlines. It's a never-ending blast of alerts. Today we actually have people who write about and brag about taking sabbaticals from their phones so that they don't get overwhelmed by the media. And you can see this quote from Tom Rosenstiel and Bill Kovach. They wrote a book, Blur, How to Know What's True in the Age of Information Overload. It was published in 2010. And their perspective is that, things are just moving too fast for people, the average news consumer, to pay attention long enough to understand what's happening in society. So the web and social media have fragmented our media sphere and led to the construction of a modern, I call it a modern Tower of Babel, which rests on the foundations of several tech platforms. led by Google, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. You can see in this MIT analysis of the filter bubbles. These are filter bubbles that, you know, all these filters, all these perspectives expressed in the filter bubbles existed offline, but they were hidden from view because there was not a platform for them to disseminate their views as widely. Now with the internet, you know, somebody in Peoria can be communicating with somebody here in Arlington, and that's how things are spreading now. So it's just easier than it ever has been to push false information. And that's really because of the technology has lowered the barriers to entry, and vastly increased the size of the potential audience. You know, about sometime in the 90s, I came to the realization that just about any idea could find an audience through the internet. And with the right leadership, the right people, those ideas could gain a lot of traction. And that brings me to the political side of things. In 2004, Richard Viguerie, kind of the father of direct mail fundraising, wrote a book, America's Right Turn: How Conservatives Used New and Alternative Media to Take Power. Viguerie had been the architect of conservative grassroots campaigning in the 60s and 70s, when conservatives felt that the media had locked out their perspective from their media platforms. So Viguerie and others launched an effort to break through, and again, Viguerie was the guy, the father of grassroots direct mail. When he was interviewed by Bill Moyers during his book tour in 2004, he told Moyers that journalism is just all opinion. I actually watched that program back then, and I remember my jaw dropping to hear that, and just a stunned look on Moyers' face at the time. Mm-hmm. But he wasn't wrong, or I shouldn't say that. He was wrong, but you know, his book documented this right turn, and really what we had was 40 years of messaging, with starting with the Reagan campaign in 1980 telling us that government is the problem, and then for a couple of decades hearing nothing but condescension when people talked about the liberal media or media bias. And today that's kind of morphed into attacks on the intelligence community and fake news. And you can see in this chart from the Edelman Trust Barometer. Edelman is a PR company, the largest PR company in the world, that has conducted a survey for 20 years now. It's called the Edelman Trust Barometer. And each year, government and media rank lower in terms of trust than business and NGOs. And I'm pretty sure there's a correlation between government and media. Media is the window on which we learn about what's happening with government. That's where the politics plays out. And as the messenger, often the media takes, I think, takes some of the brunt of government's failures. So some of the impact that we see from these attacks on the media is, you know, we've heard this term false equivalency emerge in the last few years. There's two-sidism, kind of an appeasement of of the right. This headline from the Washington Post appeared on the morning of, in the print version, on the morning of January 22nd. That was the day after the Senate, excuse me, the day after the Senate had determined the rules for the impeachment trial. And they went into that day-long debate about the rules with a proposal for a 2-day trial that would not allow evidence or witnesses. And by the end of the day, they had indeed made allowance for 1 additional day, but still no evidence and no witnesses. And yet this was a trial, and the Post just missed the point altogether. I actually wrote a letter to the Post calling them out on this, and they published it, but they cut my last line, which was, "This is how democracy dies in darkness."
Mhm.
So how do we restore the fourth estate? Well, for one thing, we don't ever use the term post-truth era. I can't tell you how many times I've heard news anchors, political pundits talking about the post-truth era. Even if they're denying that it exists, acknowledging the term gives it reality, gives it some basis in fact. It reminds me of when the media and the Obama administration accepted a term that's coined by the right to describe the Affordable Care Act. That was Obamacare. Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act have 2 very different meanings. And the media and actually, frankly, President Obama just missed the boat on that. I think that they were foolish to accept that term, and I think the media would be foolish to accept the term post-truth, because really what we need to do is double down on the truth. And there are a lot of organizations doing that. You know, a number of these organizations, the Washington Post, you know, factcheck.org or PolitiFact, are checking and debunking disinformation and misinformation after the fact. And that has an important role. It's not as effective, unfortunately, as debunking at the point of contact, you know, which I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. That's a much more challenging thing to do. Online, some of us have used Snopes when we come across a meme on Facebook or Twitter that strikes the wrong chord. You know, I've gone to Snopes about a half dozen times to confirm whether something is, you know, to see if Snopes has sniffed it out. And indeed, on several occasions, they have debunked something that a friend of mine has posted, and so I'll debunk it in the thread on Facebook. Excuse me. So, but the key for the point of, at the point of contact is to limit. I know some people are struggling with this idea of limiting platform access. It's hard to keep the president off of TV. It's hard to keep the president out of the news. It's hard to keep us, you know, well, I should say Twitter and Facebook finally took some action and knocked Alex Jones off of his platform. But it's difficult in a country that values free speech as much as we do. It's difficult to shut that down. But again, we have that precedent of Alex Jones. Private companies are not obligated and can do that. So one of the other things we can do is make better news consumers. Couple of, well, there are a whole number of groups out there that are developing online interventions. NewsGuard and Factmata are two of them. They've developed a browser extension. They each have a browser extension for Chrome and Firefox, I think. They're similar, but they do somewhat different things. NewsGuard is a human-driven platform that reviews news websites according to a variety of factors and rates those websites, so that when you go to a news website, you could pull down the NewsGuard extension and it would tell you how credible that website tends to be. Factmata takes a more page-driven approach using artificial intelligence. Their algorithm evaluates the text on the text on a page according to a number of different criteria for political bias, whether it's clickbait, whether there's any racism or sexism or other factors. I've applied Factmata on a range of different pages, and quite frankly, it's been a while since I've used it, but they have a ways to go in terms of their AI, but it's an interesting approach that is only going to get more effective. The News Literacy Project they take a different approach, more educational approach, and they develop programs for teachers to teach high school students how to know what to trust in the digital age. Actually, they have an email if you sign up for it that is actually very useful for, I'm not a student, but I find it very interesting and very helpful in the work I do. We could also be more transparent about bias. This is somewhat heretical, I know, for some journalists, but the American Press Institute has a fabulous guide to bias and objectivity, which is available online. They ask some important questions. What if journalists acknowledge that bias does exist? That it colors their choices. That news judgment does reflect the journalist's background, as well as the organization's mission and business model. These are not revelations, I think, for most of us on this call, but very few journalists, I think, would admit that publicly. I do want to just point out this idea of news judgment and recall Vigory's comment to Bill Moyers about news being opinion. You could say two sides of the same coin. There's a very big difference here, but he may not have been entirely wrong. Finally, another quote from this guide, bias can be the foundation for investigative journalism. I think also bias can be the basis for conversation, whereas today it's been so weaponized that it's really more used to dismiss a point of view or shut down conversation. So API really takes a different perspective on bias, neutralizing, I think, very effectively neutralizing our concerns. So we should move on from that debate, I think. Taking that transparency idea a little further, the Trust Project is a consortium of news organizations, including The Economist, the Globe and Mail, Italy's La Repubblica, the Washington Post, as well as the Wall Street Journal, Google, Facebook. A range of organizations are involved in developing these trust indicators. They have about 37 trust indicators right now, and they're being implemented. Essentially, they take these criteria, these 37 indicators, and they develop tags, a standard set of tags that get embedded in HTML code. And they're working with a organization called schema.org, which creates an underlying set of standards essentially for websites. And so Google and Facebook and Bing are then able to read those tags and determine the credibility of the source that they're scanning. So another approach is outcomes. This one is a little more closer to my heart, and really, it's a term that I've used. I think I don't know that anyone else uses it, but it's one that I came up with during my 14 years publishing a patient education website on laboratory testing. I learned during that period that lab scientists, when they're developing and evaluating a new lab test, evaluate that test based on whether it improves health outcomes. So for example, if a new test comes out that reduces the time to get results from 4 days to 40 minutes, that gives the medical provider an opportunity to intervene more quickly and provide a treatment, if necessary, to the patient in 40 minutes as opposed to 4 days. Think about that, what that could mean with coronavirus. So I got to thinking as I was developing the American Leader, what if we applied that idea of outcomes to the news and tried to look at the news and evaluate what news we covered based on whether we thought that news would change any outcomes, change our understanding of what was happening in the world. I learned I wasn't the only one thinking about that. And in fact, outcomes-driven media has a relationship to something called service journalism. And that's what Outlier Media practices. Sarah Alvarez, the founder of Outlier Media, was a former civil rights lawyer and who was dissatisfied with the results she was able to achieve. And so she became an NPR reporter in Michigan, focused on low-income communities. And after some time reporting for NPR, she left. She just got frustrated because, as she says, she grew tired of writing about low-income communities for rich people. And so she decided to create Outlier Media, which essentially takes a lot of the information that she might have reported on NPR, but instead she takes this publicly available information and connects it to the residents in the low-income communities that she wants to serve. She doesn't have a newspaper, she doesn't have a website. What she does is she texts the information to people. And she follows it up if there's if the information isn't sufficient to empower or enable the residents to advocate for themselves. She'll do some additional investigation to help those residents hold the city managers more accountable to their communities. It's a really interesting kind of micro approach to connecting people with information. With the American Leader, we take a little bit more of a meta approach. Our effort is aimed at serving all concerned citizens who would like to have a landscape view of the systemic problems that are shaping our lives, and who want an efficient way to track progress on what's happened, on how they're being solved, and who is solving them. I kind of look at it, what we're trying to do is provide a noise-free snapshot of these problems and the progress. And for anyone really, for news consumers who may lack the time and energy to consult, to read the news on a daily basis, or for the daily news consumer who really doesn't have the time or energy to research a problem in depth. Going back to that Tom Rosenstiel quote, you know, we do the legwork, we do the robust and prolonged inquiry, and then we present it in the form of an intelligence brief, and then report on the progress being made on the ground around the country. And, so both Sarah's effort and our efforts with the American Leader are really more focused on results than the drama of storytelling. And that's kind of what I mean by outcomes-driven media. So now, you know, we've got some solutions at work. We've got some understanding of what got us here. We kind of need to recalibrate our thinking and get out of this box of where we're looking at the news as biased and fake and the partisanship and the filter bubbles, and really take a clear-eyed look at what media is and how it develops. You know, and really, I've only just scratched the surface of all the efforts that are being made to restore trust in media. But I think we've gone to some pretty deep and existential territory. One of the silver linings to the Trump era is that we're all now woke to the faults in the media ecosystem. And they're significant, but I don't think that they're irreparable. As problem solvers, and I think putting things in a problem-solving framework is an effective approach for media. We need to keep all options on the table. You know, the beauty of our democracy is that it is an organic system that has proven very capable of adapting to the fluid circumstances of the moment. That's actually one of the founding principles of the American Leader. And I think it's one that we all need to put some faith in. So again, I've just scratched the surface. There are lots of resources out there for further engagement. Bob had mentioned the HBO documentary, After Truth, Disinformation and the Cost of Fake News. That's a really interesting, provides a really interesting look at a lot of the conspiracy theories that you know, we've heard about over the years. It also talks about, there's a segment on a disinformation campaign run by Democrats against Roy Moore in the Alabama race a couple of years ago. And Scott, I don't want to embarrass you, but if you're on and can stick around, I don't know if people would have any questions for you. Scott Shane is was the New York Times reporter who broke that story. On the Media is one of my favorite podcasts. This particular segment echoes some of what of the frustration that Sarah Alvarez had identified in terms of her frustrations with developing stories for rich audiences. And when you think about it, the business model for media is being advertising, up until recently, being mostly advertiser driven. Advertisers want to reach people who have money. And so Sarah's not off the mark on that. The New America Foundation just published a report about 10 days ago. It's not just the content, it's the business model, Democracy's Online Speech Challenge. They are obviously focused online, but that's available for download. There are links here. I'll make those links available. Misinfocon is about a 3-year-old organization that is addressing misinformation in all its forms. they're a great resource to tap into. And the Credibility Coalition grew out of MisinfoCon, and they're more of a research community that's developing common standards for information credibility. So I'd like to leave you with this quote from Abraham Lincoln. I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts and beer. This being in Dartmouth, I felt it was appropriate to mention beer. I thought it would be too corny though to open a beer now, but you know, what the hell. So that is the presentation. I hope you'll take a look at the American Leader, spread the word, give us some feedback, and if you can sponsor us or support us in other ways, that would be great. And that's where we are. Any questions?
So, George, Steve Brody here, if I may. Thank you for that. It was a very useful presentation, even though I know a bit about the American Leader. My initial thought right at the end there is you know, Germany after World War II, post-Holocaust and all that, did some significant things in curtailing free speech that they felt was incitement. Things about the Holocaust, about the Nazi regime and whatever. And they outlawed certain things. And we don't, and we're a lot more open in our society. And as devil's advocate, I'm just wondering, you know, if we're too open. and I say that not necessarily that I support that position, but just to put it on the table, see what you think.
I think that question has to be on the table. Like I said, everything needs to be on the table now, and we're at a critical juncture, and it is certainly something that needs to be debated again. I think one of the things that we've found, for example, in the climate change debate, is you know, there's no desire to have government involved in a solution to climate change, and so that discussion isn't even on the table. Mitch McConnell won't even allow that on, you know, put that on the table, and so we have this stalemate in terms of making progress on climate change. So I think questions like the one you raised, it's a fair question to ask. I'd be curious if any of the journalists or others, academics out there, have a thought on that.
This is Scott. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, I excuse me, I just retired from the New York Times at the end of 2019, and before that I was a reporter for 40 years. So I mean, more broadly, I find what you're doing very, very interesting and provocative, but a little bit naive in the sense that you seem to be a fairly opinionated guy. You've dropped a few hints about Donald J. Trump, for example. Mm-hmm. And yet you are going to be the guy who sort of, you know, is going to be, in effect, deciding what the facts are, where bias is, what's real and what's not real. And you know, I guess my experience as a journalist, and certainly the kind of ethic that I've operated in, is that you do a lot of reporting, and the truth emerges, the facts emerge, and they may emerge Monday looking like one thing and Tuesday looking like something else. And this coronavirus, for example, you know, a lot of us, I suspect on this call, are rolling their eyes or making fun of Trump or criticizing Trump seriously for his rosy view early on of the coronavirus. But there's a very interesting Atlantic story by Zeynep Tufekci of University of North Carolina, and I think she has a Twitter thread on this as well, where she points out that a lot of the mainstream media were also taking the position for quite a while that this isn't nearly as bad as flu, which kills 50,000 people every year, and people should not overreact, and so on. So, and I think, those who were shocked, as I was, by Trump suggesting that he would like to see packed churches on Easter Sunday, have to also look at Tom Friedman, who 3 days earlier had suggested that, we kind of need to keep an eye on when we can get the economy going again, because a lot of people can die as a consequence of economic disruption.
Sure.
So I just think your sort of supposition that there is the truth, and and that what it is, that was the implication of what I took from what
Sure.
you're saying. Seems a little naive.
Yeah, no, I don't think anyone pretends to know what the truth is, but we do have experts. You rely on those experts as a reporter.
Yep.
To help you understand the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's possible to go out and search for the best available knowledge and assemble that into a coherent perspective. And just addressing the point about Trump, while the media may also have gotten it wrong early on, they didn't call it a hoax. There's a history to Donald Trump that is that needs to be remembered, and what he says and does, there's a context to it.
Absolutely.
But sorry.
Can I chime in?
Sure.
Hi, Peter Kilmark's here. So I think we might differentiate between the words of a politician and the words of a journalist. And politicians are going to be politicians, but I guess my question, what I'll end up with is my question about, are there not professional standards for journalists? So I'm actually very closely tracking and involved with the COVID-19 response, and have remarked on the White House press briefings, and that we should all be packing the churches at Easter, or that we're all going to be saved by warm weather or chloroquine and other things that some of those statements are somewhat you could make a public health parallel to crying fire in a crowded theater. And I've also noted that some press outlets have said they're no longer broadcasting the White House briefings because of the misinformation that's included in those. And also observations that these press briefings have in some way replaced the campaign rallies as a way of the White House being able to project a voice. And also noted that now the president's approval rating is at all-time high, and disapproval, obviously at all-time low. But my question is, isn't there some professional society or standard for journalists? I'm a physician. If I were engaged in malpractice, if I were as a professional just saying things that were demonstrably not true again and again and again, I would be censured. I wouldn't be able to practice. So is there not some equivalent for that in the journalism world? And just, George, to say thanks for the work that you're doing and a great presentation bringing us together.
Thank you. Yeah, there are. I mean, I am not a professionally trained journalist. Scott, you might be able to answer about the standards. There are standards out there. I think the American Press Institute has addressed some of the flaws in those standards. They talk about objectivity, which is, the gold standard for a journalist. And they say that, and they acknowledge that a lot of journalists get very defensive on this point, and that some journalists have confused the capacity to approach things objectively and manage to use an objective perspective to manage their own biases with being objective themselves. So it's either a tool or a state of being, and for a lot of journalists, it's become a state of being. And API, says no, that's not how it was originally intended.
I guess if I would just on the question of whether there are standards for journalism, it's a little complicated because journalists, unlike doctors, are not licensed by the government. And there's obviously a very good reason for that, which is you don't want the government licensing journalists. And the current administration would be a great example of why that would be a bad system. But within traditional news organizations, that we want to call them, or major news organizations, there are all kinds of standards, rules, conventions. They often aren't hard and fast because they're usually complicated situations, and usually there's a whole group of people who are, brought together to make judgment about it. So a story might be written by one person or three people and edited by two or three others. And, so there's sort of a consensus at work. There are other standards, and at a place like the New York Times, you get reminded every year or two. We'll get some kind of missive about, for example, anonymous sources, and there will be a push to try to, get people to go on the record and not speak anonymously if you can, and if you can't, at least tell the readers something about the source and the source's motive and so on, so that people can sort of judge where the information is coming from. So it's it is different from other professions in the sense that there's not a government enforced rule book. You can't suspend our license and say you can't practice journalism anymore, but that's inevitable. So there was another, I think there was another.
Scott, sorry, just not in terms of government, but can't there be, or isn't there some just professional society censure, or if someone's, part of our guild and they're behaving irresponsibly, that should be called out?
Well, I mean, in reputable news organizations, if you do something that is perceived by, a majority of your colleagues, put it that way, professional colleagues, as, outrageously wrong, usually you'll be held to account in some way by the news organization. And I think that happens on a regular basis. For example, people will tweet something that others feel is a sort of flagrant expression of opinion that they shouldn't be expressing because they're a reporter trying to cover something in a fair way. They'll often have their hands slapped. That happened to the Washington Post a few weeks ago. But beyond that, at the sort of micro level, news organizations, certainly newspapers, are one of the few organizations that sort of corrects things on a daily basis. So if you get something factually wrong, there's a whole system to require that you say, hey, we got this wrong yesterday, and the fact is this other thing, which is kind of unusual, and it's certainly an ethic that I hope doesn't get lost in the shift to digital media.
Yeah.
Randy Ferguson, can I jump in, or do you want to say something, George?
No, go ahead.
I come out of the intelligence world, and we've got lots of standards, and the journalists have lots of standards, and we have a lot of fact checkers. And in fact, I'm supposed to be in Honolulu now with a panel, the International Studies Association, looking at how do you deal with false narratives and create positive narratives. And one of the conclusions, we got a group from Canada, Greece, Romania, Italy, and we've been dealing with this for a couple of years now. And the first thing we kind of came to the conclusion is that fact checkers get you nowhere. You've got a major narrative out there. We call them destructionists versus constructionists. And the destructionists are out there to pull everything down, and you can check them and you can correct them, but it will never catch up with what they've done. And just looking at what Trump has done with his press conferences, his ratings go up 5%. And what I would say is you want to get the Council of Governors to do a counter press conference. So we've kind of worked our way through a logic, and I'll just do it really quickly. Facts aren't going to get you to where you want to be. The false narratives are too powerful. The cognitive biases are too easily manipulated. And the emotions, we're moving into a world of emotion and not facts. Mm-hmm. Moving into a world of emotion, our conclusion was you really need to come up then with a positive narrative that is going to counter along the lines of what George was doing here. You've got to come up with the real facts and a real narrative that is going to motivate people and get things done in a constructive way versus a negative. But what we're worried about is that in order to do that correctly, you still need to use emotion. So can you get positive anger? Can you get positive fear? And some ideas is maybe you can if you have school children who are kind of tired of gun control, or you look at global climate change. Can you build positive narratives? And what you want to do is basically ignore what's going on in the negative narratives. They will continue to do their echo chambers, but you need to have a counterbalance that allows you to say there's a lot more going on that requires a lot more attention. So if you just had the scientists saying this is how to think about coronavirus now, and did that independent of what's going on at the White House, at least you'd have a counterbalancing. So that's just an idea.
Well, they did have the scientists speaking freely for a couple of months up until Pence was identified as the czar, and all the communications then had to go through the White House.
And all the warnings that the intelligence community gave in January and February weren't allowed to be broadcast because they shut down the worldwide briefing, which I used to participate in. And it was a hugely important thing to tell the American public what are the threat environment that we have to deal with in the next year. I think that was a huge decision not to allow the intelligence community to present its view of what the threat environment was this year.
George, this is Lori Newman. I'm a doctor. That's my disclaimer, not a journalist. One of the things you mentioned and one of the solutions you suggested was, one potential suggestion was to have journalists acknowledge their bias and to put it out there up front and say, this is my bias. But how does someone do that? I mean, what are you practically suggesting someone do? I mean, isn't that intrinsic in your bias? And what exactly are you saying is a person's bias? Is it their geography? Is it their religion? Is it their age? Is it where they went to college?
No, it's all of that.
So, but how realistically does a journalist do that? And
yeah, no.
Does the journalist do it, or should it be someone outside that says, "Hey, you are a"?
I think the intent there is not for the journalist to say, "Hey, I'm from New York City. I like urban life, and that's not the intent. The intent, I think, is to restore the journalist's confidence in their own reporting and their own gut, so that they don't fall prey to this idea of having to consider and include the other side when the evidence is clearly pointing toward a conclusion. Now, to Scott's point, yeah, more facts may come out, and so then you have to do a follow-up story. But a conclusion is not set in stone. But there's a body of knowledge that you have, and you need to be able to, in order to be a decision maker, and true, reporters are not necessarily decision makers, but in order to be a decision maker, you have to be able to act on with confidence in the knowledge you have, and so you have to understand the scope of that knowledge and what you don't know. the limits to what you don't, to what we do know about a particular topic. And coronavirus is a good example of, there's a lot of stuff we don't know about coronavirus.
George, can I make a comment? Bob here. I think the word bias it just is an explosive kind of term, and we all react against it. It's a negative. And I think a better term is perspective and values. And we when you were discussing what that may include, and there are a lot of neutral words, things that we don't think are terrible that you use. So I think it's right. Perspective, point of view. So you're you all is in your head, values and things that you tend to you tend to include in your view of the facts. And I think let's put this out there. Facts are real. It's just a question of which ones we look at. And some people have a screen that's more liberal or a screen that's more moral, I would say. And you're going to look at certain things. You're going to look at what's the impact of that event on the poor people. And somebody else is worried about the impact on the GDP.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because your point of view, your perspective, where you're looking, but there is a whole huge realm of facts. I'm concerned about the word bias and saying, oh yeah, we all have bias, and there's no objectivity. Those are concerning because I think they lead to a sense of relativity, a moral relativity, as well as epistemological relativity, that there are no facts. So I saw that in the HBO TV show. There was one of the right-wing wackos, pardon the negative, was saying
bias.
was saying, he's the guy that the New Knowledge website. He's the proprietor of the New Knowledge website, and he's making the claim that there are no facts. We are post facts, so everything is opinion. Just the kind of same thing you were quoting before, which is I'm concerned that notion has been bubbling along here for 30 or 40 or more years, along with moral relativism. And I think those are the insidious things that we need to be on the lookout for and try to correct. And I'm in terms of solutions, I like your reference to, well, several of the things you pointed out. I like, especially the kind of civics lesson for school kids, and I'd like to look more into those things. And I'd be curious, to what extent are those actually being used, for example, or possibly being used in the future in both the media, the media outlets and the schools.
Yeah.
Getting civics and morals back into our bloodstream.
Yeah, and into the education system. And on that note, Peter reminds me, this is a Bridgers program. So I'm going to ask the Bridgers out there,
right,
if you have any comments or any questions.
And we also haven't yet turned to Matt for his discussion of fact checking.
Matt, do you want to step into the spotlight?
If there's no other questions, I don't actually see that many Bridgers on, but can you hear me all right, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, if there's no other questions, I'm happy to explain my job and my experience with the Bridgers program thus far. Yeah. Hey everybody, my name is Matt. I don't really have any comments on the presentation, but I can definitely give my thoughts and experience so far as just a young journalist who's not even like a full year into the industry. But yeah, I started off right after Dartmouth as a editorial intern at Politico, which is a 12-year-old political media outlet here in DC. Like, started on entirely online, and was able to really get some great experience there. And I've just started my first full-time job as a fact check reporter at USA Today. My job is basically born out of USA Today's partnership with Facebook, where Facebook is really interested, obviously today, in helping to create new ways of fact checking a lot of the disinformation that's on the platform. So they've partnered with a lot of different independent media outlets, USA Today being one of them, to help to fact check some of the trending topics and disinformation and most like dubious claims that are kind of like going under the radar that each of us in our own Facebook little bubbles isn't able to see, but Facebook, the company, is obviously able to like look at the analytics and say like, this is what's trending in the United States, this is what's trending in Brazil. And they partner with people around the world to do that. So that's part of, so oftentimes my assignment editor is usually actually whatever is trending on Facebook in terms of fact checking that. I've written a lot of explainer articles in the couple weeks that I've been at USA Today, just kind of like a lot on coronavirus recently, talking about whether XYZ rumor that's been circulating is true or not, fact checking different claims made by high profile officials, explaining what the Fed actually did when it gave when it injected 1.5 trillion into the economy, and then just getting into the origins of the coronavirus. That's occasionally gotten me into some interesting places. I had some Chinese bots come after me the other day. I've had vegans get very angry at me about some posts that we fact checked, and most recently I've had QAnon people come after me. So I've been 3 weeks in the job, but it's already been pretty eventful. So that's my day. So yeah, that's what I do.
Well, if you're getting people coming after you, it sounds like you're doing your job pretty well.
I mean, I think that all journalists, we do our best, and that's all we can ask, and that we ask the public trusts us to do that, and then we go from there. So
I'd like to ask a question as to how do you deal with the tension between, and what is your recommendation between saying, well, this was wrong and these are the facts, which I think we were saying earlier in George's presentation, doesn't have a lot of stickiness to it, versus saying this is wrong and it just has to be taken down. And that obviously has huge financial costs if you're going to go the takedown route. But how do you deal with those kinds of tensions?
Is your question how to deal with in the writing of the stories and the explaining?
Well, the question is, you're doing the fact checking, but is there also a need to basically take the story off of Facebook, or take the posting off, because the bad news moves so much more quickly than the good news. The good news never catches up.
So that's actually the really interesting thing about the partnership that USA Today and PolitiFact and some other newsrooms are involved in with Facebook right now, because Facebook has has made it very clear, and I've actually seen this on the platform, that if we do flag something as being incorrect, then Facebook will heavily demote it. They won't directly take it down, but it won't appear in people's feeds anymore. And then also, if we write a fact check correction story, then Facebook will reach back out to anyone who viewed it, even if briefly, to tell them that they did just recently view either disinformation from some foreign actor, or just misinformation from someone within their own country, and that this is actually a fact check from verified fact checkers to say what is true or what isn't. So there are people out there who are actually working on the solution to that problem. So there's actually 119 who I was friends with at Dartmouth, who he works at Facebook on the team that comes up with the algorithms that actually like runs the program, and I'm on the editorial side actually like doing the fact checking. So it's kind of cool, like a little big green network of people trying to save democracy.
So is there a takedown option, Matt, in what you do?
I don't take them down. I write the fact check, and then Facebook does what Facebook does.
Gotcha.
I was going to ask how you keep up, like someone was mentioning before that there's so many like fake news circulating, and like fact checking is great, but you can only keep up with the news so much as it's moving, and how you deal with all the fake news that's still out there that you have, like, I mean, you just can't fact check everything, and how you handle that.
Well, yeah, we can't fact check everything, which is why we're hiring 3 more like people for my position to also help out with this. We're not going to get everything. It's a big world. We can only do our best to make sure that we get the biggest most high-profile issues. There's only so much that can be done with one day, and there's only so many resources to go around, especially in an industry like journalism. But as long as people continue to pay attention and as long as the revenue stream comes in, I believe that newsrooms are going to continue to try and pursue this and make the situation better. So yeah.
Well, and another answer to that question, I am aware that Facebook has hired their own fact checkers, I think.
Thousands.
And there are, as my understanding, thousands of them. But to your question though, I think, and I think this is Randy's point also, you know, you can debunk some facts or some disinformation, but the incorrect information, the misinformation will persist. You know, the no vaxxer is a really classic example, where that's been debunked for decades, well, a couple decades. I mean, even by the guy who wrote the initial report, and yet the belief still persists. So
I guess, given this, Matt, I guess I would just wonder, like, what else do you think can be done outside of fact checking to stop misinformation?
Yeah. So for anyone who was more recently on campus, I don't know if anyone took a class from Brendan Nyhan.
I did.
He is
yeah.
Yeah,
he actually told me about
he's
you.
He's a homie. Oh, he did? Oh my
God.
God.
When I was looking into this, so I just took this class with Professor Nyhan on political misinformation and conspiracy theories. And I actually forwarded this link to Nyhan. He's renowned in the field and has been doing a lot on research on this, and he gave you a shout out and said you were one of his students.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, no, Nyhan's a homie. Yeah, so Nyhan's research has actually done a lot of stuff, and he's like a pseudo opinion journalist too, where he's the New York Times because he's so prominent, giving him columns to write. But Nyhan has written basically a lot about how, like, I think the question does come down a bit to, we can fact check certain things and we can put the facts out there, but it does fall, humans are people with agency, it does fall to people to believe it at some point. And a lot of Nyhan's research is into how the psychology of belief works and how the psychology of disinformation works. So I would say I would defer to those studies because I trust his research in terms of, like, how do you actually convince a person to change their mind about something or to change the disbelief about a thing. My understanding of it is that usually it doesn't actually work with persuasion. Like, facts alone don't change people's minds. And initial exposure to something, we do know that if you just keep saying something over and over again, it doesn't matter how not true it is, people will just start to believe it or just become more receptive to it over time. So there's a lot of psychology and that goes into our politics, and I think that that's going to be something that both media organizations and civic institutions of all kinds are going to have to deal with for quite some time to come.
I'd like to pick up on that just for a second. Some of the work that our group has done on cognitive processes, and I've done a lot of work on cognitive bias and how it affects analytical decision making. And what's really scary as you look into cognitive bias is that they are extremely powerful. If you look at anchoring, confirmation bias, groupthink, vividness bias, and the perpetrators of fake news and disinformation intuitively, I'm doing some research now with a colleague at Glasgow University, an intern, to try to publish a paper and do some empirical work on, are the perpetrators of disinformation consciously using and manipulating these cognitive biases to improve the power of their message and what they're doing. We've been able to find patterns in what the Russians and the Macedonian kids and everybody else are doing, that they're applying the concept of confirmation bias or a vividness bias. You see it come through pretty strongly in what gets posted and what they're trying to do. But what scares us is that the first thing that I teach in my classes is, once you have a bias and you have a mental mindset, you have a framework, how you believe it, you just ain't going to change it. Facts aren't going to usually ever get you to change it. You need some very powerful techniques or a process to get you out of that mindset. And all of us that are living in our echo chambers then are constantly being reinforced the wrong way and moved away from that. So trying to overcome those cognitive biases is a very depressing sort of thing to go after.
Well, and I think that's what Walter Lippmann was talking about, though, in journalism. His idea of journalism was, you do try to manage your biases as you're doing your reporting. You've got to be aware of them, though, first, and that's what I think maybe API is commenting, that awareness is lost.
But the problem there is that we move into the post-truth era, which we'll never say again. We're not arguing over facts and rational debate and rational discourse anymore, most of the discussion focuses around perception management and views and opinions. And you've moved into identity politics, and you've seen a lot of things published on that. So people are processing how they perceive information based upon their identity and based upon their group or whatever. It's very hard, if not impossible, in these days to kind of swing them around to a more enlightened view by simply trying to argue facts. I don't think it's going to work anymore.
Yeah, I've lately been distinguishing between facts and knowledge, and I think we need to emphasize the knowledge side of the equation a lot more, but we're not there yet.
Let me just add a couple little points. This is Scott. One is to point out what's undoubtedly obvious to most people, which is that it is the change in the technology of media that has driven so much of this. Just 30 or 40 years ago, we basically had a newspaper that landed on our lawn and 3 or 4 networks. And the business model of all those news organizations was to appeal to everybody because, they couldn't swing right or swing left because they'd basically be cutting out half of their potential customers. And that, as you pointed out briefly, then came cable, then came the internet, then came social media, and just sort of shattered that into a million pieces. And then, kind of in some kind of, it seems, synergistic way, politics has become increasingly polarized. And so one of the things that used to disturb me as a New York Times reporter is that all of the people, the 70 million people who theoretically could see one of Trump's tweets, calling the New York Times the failing New York Times and giving a point of view on something. It's not so much that, I don't mind if somebody reads the New York Times and says that's a bunch of bullshit. It's that the overwhelming majority of his core audience is never going to look at the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And I always urge people who read the New York Times to watch Fox and subscribe online to some, conservative emails and sort of mix it up. And I think that's really the closest you can come to getting out of your bubble and challenging your ideas. And one other point I wanted to make briefly, I haven't followed it closely enough to really know the details, but it is my impression from just casual observation that these social media companies, of which I'm extremely skeptical, I've written a great deal about Facebook, and I've written a great deal about what the Russians did to Facebook in the 2016 election. But it is what I hear and what I see is that Facebook and Twitter and Google are all doing a better job now. They've actually made some progress. And I was sort of fascinated to see yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, the Federalist, a right-wing publication website, put up a story that promoted, why don't we all go get the virus because it's not that bad, and it'll be like chicken pox parties in olden times. And it was written by a dermatologist, I believe. It was an actual MD. And Twitter took it down. Actually, no, Twitter put a label on it that said, actually, I have it here. It said, warning, this link may be unsafe. When I first clicked on a reference to it, a link to it on Twitter, it didn't take me to the Federalist story. It took me to this warning label. This link may be unsafe. The link you're trying to access has been identified by Twitter or our partners as being potentially harmful or associated with a violation of Twitter's terms of service. So it doesn't really tell you what's wrong with it. But it did flag it, and Federalists apparently subsequently took it down. So that's, boy, I'll tell you, that was not happening even a year ago. So it's interesting to see how these huge platforms whose initial stance, you know, when they basically just cared about getting more users and nothing else, was we're just a neutral platform, don't blame us for anything that appears. They've been forced, you know, since 2016 to abandon that position, to really take on this challenge, as Matt was explaining with Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, there's still a ways to go, but I think that's a good point, and maybe a good point to end on, because we are getting up to the 8:30 time frame. Yeah, you know, business needs to get, you know, needs to take this seriously, and put their responsibility to truth and democracy ahead of their bottom line.
And George, how about the advertisers that are on, you know, these advertisers that are paying for, you know, our Trump TV, et cetera, as well as in all the advertising. They have ought to have, now and then you hear one of them pipe up, but not very often, and use their influence, use their money. Pull the plug.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, that the model either has to change, or, you know, there's just got to be some acceptance that there's a social responsibility here. Yeah. So I apologize if there were people who had questions that we haven't been able to address.
How about any bridgers out there who haven't been heard, who'd like to be heard?
Any other bridgers? No. Bob, you have any words? Thank you all for
Thank you, George, very much.
participation.
And let's do it again. And I hope we can all get together on K Street in our clubhouse with a little food and see each other, you know, less distant, but everybody stay safe.
Thank you. Good job, all.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.